Picture a Confederate horseman boxed in on every side in the middle of a cavalry clash, out of time and almost out of bullets. 6 shots fired, enemies still closing. He raises the same revolver one more time, except he's already flipped a small lever hidden on the hammer. The pistol in his hand isn't empty. It was never just a pistol. Running straight through the center of the cylinder, in the exact place where every other revolver hides a plain steel pin, sits a second weapon entirely. A short, brutal shotgun barrel, loaded and waiting the whole fight. One more pull of the trigger, and a wall of buckshot answers for him. The men closing in on him have no idea a weapon like this even exists. That weapon was real. It rode into some of the bloodiest cavalry actions of the Civil War, strapped to the belts of Confederate officers, whose names still show up in the history books. And it existed because revolvers of the 1850s were built around a problem nobody had solved: what happens after the bullets run out. A cavalry charge is not a duel with polite distance and time to think. It's chaos at a full gallop, sabers swinging, horses colliding, men close enough to grab each other's coats. In that kind of fight, a standard revolver of the era gave an officer 5 or 6 shots, and then nothing. Reloading a cap and ball pistol meant both hands, loose powder, a ramrod, and roughly the amount of calm nobody has while 3 men are trying to close in on him at once. Colt, the biggest name in the business, had built a superb weapon. But it was still, at its core, a 6-shot answer to a problem that didn't stop at 6. For most gunmakers of the era, the obvious fix was to chase bigger numbers the obvious way. Cram in one more chamber, stretch the cylinder another ½ inch, and call it progress. Every version of that idea ran into the same wall. A heavier cylinder meant a heavier, slower gun. And there's a hard physical limit to how many chambers you can wrap around a center pin before the whole thing stops working like a revolver at all. Nobody had thought to ask a different question. Nobody, that is, except a man with no business designing firearms in the first place. The man who decided that gap was unacceptable wasn't a gunsmith. He was a doctor. Jean-Alexandre LeMat was a French-born physician who'd settled in New Orleans, a city stitched into nearly every trade route running down the Mississippi. He had no formal training in weapons. Over the course of his life, he'd end up filing patents in medicine, in shipping, even in early aviation. A gun was just one more problem he thought he could out-engineer. And the problem in front of him was blunt. How do you hand one man 10 shots when he doesn't have time to reload even one? His answer, patented in October of 1856, didn't try to cram more chambers into the cylinder the way everyone else was. He went somewhere no one else had gone. Instead of the plain steel axis pin every ordinary revolver was built around, LeMat replaced it with an actual barrel. A second, wider, smoothbore tube sitting exactly where the gun's skeleton should be, loaded independently with a full charge of buckshot. The cylinder above it still fired 9 rifled shots, one at a time, like any revolver on the market. But underneath them, built into the very frame of the weapon, rather than bolted onto it, sat a 10th shot capable of tearing through a man at arm's length. A shotgun wearing a revolver as a disguise. It sounds almost too clever to be practical, and for a while, nobody with real authority agreed it was worth the risk. LeMat brought the design in front of the United States military, hoping for the kind of contract that turns a patent into a product. The Army wasn't impressed enough to bet on it, not because the mechanism failed on the table, but because the design had no factory behind it, no track record, nothing to reassure a peacetime committee that this was a weapon worth trusting at scale. The rejection should have ended things right there. A brilliant, strange idea, filed away and forgotten before it ever fired a shot in anger. Except LeMat had one connection the U.S. Army had no reason to weigh yet. His wife's cousin was a rising military officer named P.G.T. Beauregard, a name about to matter a great deal more than any peacetime committee that had just turned this gun down. Within a few short years, the decision over whether the LeMat lived or died would no longer belong to Washington at all. It would belong to a country that hadn't been born yet, and to a war that would make LeMat's strange, rejected idea worth more than gold. Take that lever between two fingers, and you're not adjusting a sight or a safety. You're switching which weapon you're holding. And the reason LeMat built it that way, one gun, two completely different ways to kill, comes down to a single piece of engineering most people miss the first time they look at this revolver. He didn't add a shotgun to a pistol. He turned the pistol's own skeleton into one. Every revolver of the 1850s is built around a simple piece of steel called an arbor, a plain pin running through the center of the cylinder that everything else spins around. It does one job: hold the cylinder in place while it rotates. LeMat looked at that pin and saw wasted space, so he removed it and put a barrel there instead. Not a small tube, not a token gesture, a real, functioning, smoothbore barrel, roughly 16 to 20 gauge, sitting exactly where the arbor used to be, loaded independently of everything else in the gun with a full charge of buckshot or a single heavy ball. The cylinder still rotates around it exactly the way a normal revolver cylinder rotates around its pin. The difference is that this particular pin can kill a man on its own. Above that hidden barrel sits the part of the gun that looks familiar. A 9-chamber cylinder, each one loaded with powder and a roughly .40 to .42 caliber ball, firing down a conventional rifled barrel just like a Colt. Fire at once, the hammer falls, the cylinder rotates, fire again, 9 times, same as counting on both hands with one finger to spare. Nothing about that part needed reinventing. It's the 10th shot, the one hiding underneath, that makes this weapon different from everything else being carried into battle that decade. Getting to that 10th shot is where the small lever comes in. The nose of the hammer isn't fixed, it pivots. Leave it in its resting position, and the hammer strikes a percussion cap lined up with whichever cylinder chamber has rotated into place, firing the revolver like normal. Flip the lever up, and the striker shifts downward to hit a separate cap seated directly beneath it, igniting the charge in the center barrel instead. No second trigger, no separate mechanism to fumble for in a fight. One small motion of a thumb changes what the next pull of the trigger actually does. A soldier could fire 9 aimed shots, and if the fight was still going, close with one motion of a lever and answer with buckshot at a range where missing simply wasn't an option anymore. Loading it took patience the mechanism itself never asked for. A ramrod mounted along the frame packed powder and ball down each of the 9 chambers by hand, then packed the center barrel separately with its own charge and shot. Every component of this weapon loaded from the muzzle, one motion at a time, the old-fashioned way, because cartridge ammunition barely existed yet outside of experimental designs. 10 shots meant 10 individual loadings before a single ride into battle. And that patience is a detail worth sitting with, because it tells you exactly who this gun was designed for. Not a soldier reloading on the move, an officer preparing once, carefully, before riding into the one moment where reloading wouldn't be possible at all. That purpose explains everything people find strange about how this revolver feels in the hand. It's heavy, loaded, it weighs over 4 pounds, nearly double some contemporary revolvers. It's long, over 13 inches from grip to muzzle, thick through the frame in a way that makes it look almost swollen compared to the sleek single-barrel revolvers beside it in a museum case. None of that is a flaw. A revolver built for aim fire at range wants to be light and balanced. A revolver built for the exact second a man is surrounded, grabbing, too close to properly aim anything, wants weight, wants width, wants a wide pattern of buckshot that forgives a shaking hand. LeMat wasn't building a duelist's weapon. He was building a last resort disguised as a sidearm. On paper, that made the LeMat close to unstoppable. 10 shots, no reload, a built-in shotgun hiding in plain sight inside an officer's holster. But every one of the features that made it brilliant on a workbench in New Orleans was about to become a nightmare the moment somebody had to actually manufacture thousands of them, ship them across an ocean, and keep them firing in the mud and gunpowder grit of an actual war. The Beauregard connection stopped being a footnote fast. By the summer of 1861, the cousin who'd married into LeMat's family wasn't a peacetime U.S. Army officer anymore. He was a Confederate general, one of the men who just opened the war by ordering the bombardment of Fort Sumter. He remembered his cousin's strange revolver, and a newly formed nation that had just declared itself independent of the largest arms industry on the continent needed every weapon it could get its hands on. Beauregard pushed. The Confederacy signed a contract for 5,000 LeMat revolvers. On paper, that should have been the moment the design finally proved itself. In practice, it exposed a problem no amount of clever engineering could fix. The Confederacy had almost nowhere to build it. The South in 1861 had cotton, tobacco, and courage. What it didn't have was the kind of precision manufacturing base needed to produce a revolver, this intricate a weapon with 2 independently loaded barrels, a pivoting striker, and tolerances tight enough that a shotgun barrel could double as the working axis of a spinning cylinder. There was no factory in the Confederacy capable of it, so LeMat did the only thing left to do. He took his own invention out of the country that had ordered it. Parts were forged in Liège, Belgium. Others were made in Paris. The pieces were shipped to Birmingham, England, to be assembled, fitted, and proofed under British law, meaning a gun built for a war in America was being stitched together piece by piece across 3 different countries, none of which were the one actually fighting. Then came the part nobody could engineer around, getting it home. Every finished LeMat had to cross the Atlantic and slip past a Union naval blockade that tightened with every month of the war. Some shipments made it through on fast blockade runners threading past Union patrol ships in the dark. Others didn't. Of the thousands ordered, roughly 2,900 LeMats were ever completed between 1856 and the end of the war in 1865, and only around 2,500 of those actually reached Confederate hands. The rest sat in warehouses, sank with captured ships, or simply never left Europe at all. A weapon designed to solve a battlefield shortage became, itself, a study in scarcity. Scarcity has a price, and this one was steep. The original contract had priced each revolver at around $35. By the time blockade running risk, wartime inflation, and the sheer difficulty of the supply chain worked their way into the final cost, a single LeMat ran closer to $80, nearly 3 times what an ordinary Confederate-issue revolver cost. This was never going to be a weapon handed to every private in the ranks. It was, by cost alone, an officer's gun before it ever fired a shot. And even the ones that made it into a holster carried a flaw baked into their own cleverness. The earliest LeMats locked their cylinder in place with a small, delicate pin, a part that worked cleanly on a workbench in a gunsmith shop and worked far less cleanly after an hour of black powder smoke, dirt, and battlefield grit had worked its way into the mechanism. Fouling could jam that pin just enough to throw the cylinder's rotation off, so it stopped short of lining up properly or spun past where it needed to be. The exact failure a man could least afford in the exact kind of close, chaotic fight this gun was built for. The weapon engineered to guarantee an officer never ran dry at the worst possible moment could, under the wrong conditions, fail him at that same moment instead. Ammunition brought its own quiet cruelty. The LeMat's revolver chambers used a non-standard caliber that didn't match the balls issued from ordinary Confederate quartermaster stores. So an officer couldn't simply draw more rounds the way he could, for a standard-issue Colt. He had to cast his own bullets or go without. And firing the shotgun barrel itself came with a kick soldiers openly complained about. A short, heavy weapon punching back hard enough that using the 10th shot was as much an act of nerve as of tactics. By any rational accounting, this should have killed the LeMat as thoroughly as the Army's rejection nearly had. Too expensive, too scarce, too finicky under fire, chambered for ammunition nobody else carried. And yet, it didn't disappear. If anything, the opposite happened. The harder it was to get one, the more an officer wanted one. Scarcity had turned a flawed, brilliant idea into a status symbol, and that shift is exactly what carried the LeMat out of workshops in Liège and onto the hips of the men who'd make it famous. If a gun that survives its own manufacturing disaster to become a legend anyway is the kind of story that's worth your time, this is a good place to stay for the rest of it. Because the names about to carry this revolver are some of the most recognizable in the entire war. An $80 revolver that fouled under fire and ate ammunition nobody else stocked was never going to end up in a private's holster. It ended up in the officer corps instead, and not scattered randomly through it, but concentrated among some of the most recognizable names to wear Confederate gray. Start with the man who made the contract happen in the first place. General P.G.T. Beauregard carried his own LeMat through the entire war, an engraved example that survives today in a museum in Richmond, Virginia. Proof, if any was needed, that the general who pushed this strange weapon into production believed in it enough to bet his own life on it. But the officer most associated with the gun wasn't Beauregard at all. It was J.E.B. Stuart. Stuart commanded Confederate cavalry the way the LeMat was built to be used, close, fast, and willing to ride straight into the middle of a fight rather than around it. He was already known through the Army for a taste for theater. The plumed hat, the cape, the flair of a man who treated war partly as performance. A revolver with a secret shotgun hidden inside it fit that image as naturally as it fit his tactics. He was known to favor the LeMat as his sidearm, and it isn't hard to see why the fit made sense on both fronts. Every design choice that made this revolver awkward for a target shooter, the weight, the width, the built-in shotgun barrel meant for point-blank range, was exactly what a cavalry commander wanted in the handful of seconds his saber charge turned into a scrum of horses and men, too close to properly aim anything. For Stuart, the LeMat wasn't a curiosity. It was the right tool arriving for exactly the kind of fighting he specialized in, and a fitting prop for the reputation he cultivated besides. What's more surprising is who else reached for one. Stonewall Jackson, an infantry general, not a cavalryman, a man not defined by the close-quarters melee this gun was engineered for, was also known to carry a LeMat. So did Braxton Bragg. So did Richard Anderson. Even Henry Worse, the officer who'd go on to command the notorious prison camp at Andersonville, owned one. None of these men needed a hidden shotgun barrel the way a cavalry officer surrounded mid-charge did. They wanted one anyway. Somewhere in the space between the gun's real utility and its reputation, the LeMat had become something more than a weapon. Carrying one said something about the kind of officer you were, and pulling it out in front of other men in uniform had a way of stopping conversation. Reputation alone doesn't fix a jamming cylinder, though, and LeMat knew it. While the gun was earning its place on the hips of Confederate generals, quieter changes were happening at the workbench in Europe to fix exactly the flaw that had made the earliest models unreliable under fire. The delicate pin that locked the cylinder in place, the part fouling loved to jam, was redesigned as a wedge instead. A simpler shape, cheaper to machine, and far more forgiving of the dirt and burnt powder residue that black powder combat packed into every moving part of a revolver. A small lever was added directly onto the hammer itself, so switching from the cylinder to the shotgun barrel took one quick motion instead of a fumbled adjustment mid-fight. Even the ramrod, originally mounted on the right side of the frame, was moved to the left, a small change, but one that made reloading faster and less awkward in the hand. None of these fixes happened all at once, and plenty of guns already in service in the field never got them at all. But collectively, they marked the moment the LeMat stopped being a brilliant idea with a reliability problem and started becoming something closer to a trusted, if still eccentric, weapon of choice. By the middle of the war, then, two very different LeMat revolvers existed side by side in the field. Earlier guns still carrying the fragile lockup that had jammed on their owners at the worst possible moments, and improved ones quietly correcting for it, both riding on the hips of men whose names would end up remembered long after the war itself. And LeMat, watching his revolver finally take hold among the officers who mattered, was already sketching out what came next. Smaller versions, different calibers, entirely new variants chasing a success this one gun had only partly delivered. The smaller versions started with the Navy. Confederate naval officers wanted something closer to their belt than the full-sized LeMat, lighter, shorter, easier to carry aboard a ship than into a cavalry charge. So LeMat scaled the whole design down. The result, later nicknamed the Baby LeMat, dropped the revolver caliber to .32 and shrank the hidden shotgun barrel down with it, keeping the same 9+1 concept in a frame small enough to actually be comfortable. The Confederacy ordered 2,000 of them in 1864. By then, the war's collapsing supply lines and dwindling money meant only around 100 were ever actually finished and delivered. A gun already rare became, in miniature, almost a ghost, which is exactly why a surviving Baby LeMat today is one of the most valuable finds in the entire field of Civil War collecting. The war ended before LeMat's ambitions did. With the Confederacy gone and his biggest customer erased from the map, he spent the years afterward trying to find the design a second life in a peacetime market that no longer cared about buckshot hidden inside a revolver's axis. He built pinfire versions, chasing the new cartridge technology sweeping through Europe. He built centerfire versions after that, trying to keep pace again. He even reimagined the whole concept as a carbine, swapped the grip for a shoulder stock, lengthened the barrels, and suddenly you're not competing with pocket revolvers anymore. You're competing directly with Colt's own revolving rifle for a completely different customer. None of it caught on. By the 1870s, the entire premise behind the LeMat, one weapon, two independently loaded barrels, everything fired single action, one careful shot at a time, was being quietly outpaced by a much simpler idea. Double-action revolvers that fired as fast as a shooter could pull the trigger, no separate hammercock required. The problem the LeMat had solved so dramatically in 1856 had, by 1870, been solved a second time, more cheaply, by somebody else. The unsold stock didn't just vanish, though. Some of it rearmed men who had nothing to do with the Confederacy at all. LeMat revolvers turned up in France's own war against Prussia in 1870, LeMat's homeland, fighting for its life the same way the Confederacy once had. And in one of the stranger footnotes in the gun's history, LeMats made their way as far as Sumatra, where the Sultanate of Aceh carried them into a decades-long war against Dutch colonial forces on the other side of the planet. A revolver engineered on a workbench in New Orleans for one very specific American cavalry problem ended up answering to soldiers, on horseback and on foot, in wars its inventor almost certainly never pictured when he filed that patent in 1856. LeMat himself went home to France for good, and when Prussia invaded in 1870, didn't sit the war out from a comfortable distance. He raised and led a legion of American volunteers back into combat on his own native soil. He lived on for another quarter century after that, filing patents in fields that had nothing to do with firearms, and died in 1895 in the French town of Provins. Most people who pick up one of his revolvers in a museum case today couldn't tell you his name. They remembered the gun. That's really the whole reason this particular revolver still stops people in front of a display case when 100 other Civil War relics don't. Most of what survives from that war is paper, or cloth, or a story you have to take on faith, a letter, a flag, a battlefield you have to imagine into motion. The LeMat isn't like that. You can still see exactly what made it strange with your own eyes. Pick one up, and there's a second barrel staring back at you from dead center of the cylinder. A mechanism you can understand just by looking at it, no imagination required. It doesn't ask you to trust a story. It shows you the idea directly, the same way it showed a Confederate officer in 1863 exactly what he was betting his life on. If a weapon this strange, this flawed, and this stubbornly memorable is the kind of history you want more of, there are other objects with stories just as unlikely waiting in this channel, worth sticking around for. And that, in the end, is the real reason the LeMat outlived every problem stacked against it. Roughly 2,900 were ever built. It never won a battle by itself, never turned a campaign, never became the standard issue sidearm its inventor dreamed it would be. What it became instead was rarer than that. The one revolver in an entire century of firearms that refused to accept the choice between a pistol and a shotgun. Built for the 1/2 second in a man's life when he genuinely couldn't afford to pick just one.